Thank you. Hello everyone. Welcome to today's NASEO-NARUC Grid-Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group. GEB is the inelegant acronym for Grid-Interactive Efficient Buildings. Welcome to you. We're very pleased to have today Paul Martini of Newport Consulting to present on using distributed energy resources, or grid edge resources, as some prefer to call them, to provide distribution level services, and Robert Cully of the New York Department of Public Service to tell us about New York's approaches to advanced DERs and provide distribution level services. We're also very happy to have our working group co-chair, Liz Reichart of the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, to moderate today. And I think a bit later she'll offer a few remarks of some things that are happening in Massachusetts on grid services and distributed resources. I'd also like to take a moment to offer our thanks to Ashley Norman of the Hawaii PUC, who has ably served as our PUC co-chair of the working group. Has done a great job, and she has indicated that she'll be stepping down from that role, but will remain active in the working group. Therefore, we are opening a search for a new co-chair from among our PUC participants. So please do let us know of your interest. And Ashley has greatly offered to email or chat with anyone who's interested who wants to know what's entailed. And why don't I pause also to recognize our good friend and colleague Jeff Loiter from NARUC and see if he has a few words to offer.
Thanks, Rod. I appreciate that. And yes, thanks to Ashley for her role and her leadership in this group. We really value the collaboration between NASEO and NARUC in this area and in many other areas. And so I hope a message to our members will welcome first, but also if you're interested, please do reach out. You can reach Rod, you can reach me. I'll put my email in the chat. And ask questions. I think everybody will agree Liz is great to work with, and we think this working group does a lot of great work. Speaking of work, our NARUC work has been a little slow on this front in terms of DERs or GERs over the past several months, but we hope to be increasing that in the coming months. And part of that is checking with our members and others about what topics are most important and timely right now. So again, please reach out if you have thoughts about topics that you'd like to see covered. If you'll be joining us in Boston next week for our conference, please don't hesitate to pull me aside or look for me at our CPI table or any of my colleagues. And one thing I will point out that we've managed to get across the finish line. We have a brand new publication on DER valuation, and it considers different models for valuing the services provided by DERs, looks closely at 4 states to do an example or sort of mini, not really case studies, but some modeling of how their tariffs and valuation approaches work out when you look at a proxy system. And I think you'll find that valuable and useful. So I will put a link to that new publication into the chat as well. Back to
Great.
you, Rod.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And we will be very happy to post that on our webpage as well as a reference for everyone, as a citation for everyone else. Next slide, please. I do want to take a couple of moments to go over some of the logistics. Please mute when not speaking. Use the Q&A, or we're not a very large group, so use the chat box to offer questions and comments. I hope towards the end we'll have time for people to virtually raise their hand and chime in verbally as well. The slides and the recordings will be posted. We'll let you know with an email to the working group and to other registrants afterwards. Next slide. I do want to provide a little bit of an overview of the working group for those of you who may be unfamiliar, and I do see a number of unfamiliar or new names in the participants list, so thank you for joining us. We are very fortunate to have Department of Energy Building Technologies Office support to work with our NARUC friends and colleagues on this Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group. I'm sure this group doesn't need to have enunciated all the potential benefits of grid interactive buildings, demand flexibility, grid edge, VPPs, and some other letters of the alphabet. But we do know that they can lower costs, enhance resilience, reduce emissions and adverse impacts to the environment, and provide operational benefits of various sorts, some of which you will be hearing about today. So fundamentally, our questions in the working group are, how can you optimize facility or end-use interactions with the grid? How can these be coordinated with grid edge resource to simultaneously serve the customers or users and the grid? How can state policies, programs, and regulations advance these benefits? And what are roles for states, facility owners and operators, utilities, technology and service providers, and others to do this? We offer forums and webinars, state exchange opportunities. At times, we've been able to facilitate national lab technical assistance, and we've provided some of our own reports, and we point also to others' resources. Next, please. We have a good number of states that participate in the working group at varying levels. Again, reiterating, Liz is our co-chair and Ashley is our departing co-chair. And again, please let us know among the PHC participants if you're interested in becoming a co-chair to the group. Next, please. Did want to give a little bit of an update. Our webpage is, I'm sorry to say, not super well organized, but we do try to keep it up to date with various information that may be useful, including District of Columbia has an RFI out on DER aggregation and FERC order number 2222 implementation. That's coming up real soon. We'll see what is submitted to the record. Maybe we'll revisit that with our DC friends in a future webinar if whatever comes out of that. Yesterday, eSig had a webinar on DER flexibility and grid services. There was a recent last month virtual workshop in California on moves towards their load shift goals involving California Energy Commission, CPUC, and CAISO. The environmental agency was there as well. I think Liz will say a few words about the grid services study up in Massachusetts. I do want to point to RMI's performance incentive mechanisms database, which we have links to. And I won't go through read all the list that's there. Visit our website. You will notice a fair amount of stuff on data center demand flexibility. And next slide, please. I will mention that our next webinar on August 7th will be on that topic. We are very happy to have that coming up, co-sponsored or under the banners of both this working group and the NASEO Powering Up Data Centers webinar series. And we'll have Tyler Norris of Duke University Nicholas Institute, who is one of the primary authors of a study on demand flexibility and large loads, particularly for data centers. And we're very excited to offer a peek at a demonstration done in Phoenix area by Emerald AI on demand flexibility in data centers involving the actual computing. So that should be pretty exciting and certainly salient. A couple of the other resources on that page. I'll have a shout out to our SEPA friends and colleagues on some of their reports and also the Brattle Group's recent New York Grid Flexibility Potential Study. And we do ask if you, we do seek your interest in future webinar topics and forum topics. So please let us know a couple of things, what your interests are, and especially what's happening in your states. It's kind of hard for us sometimes to keep track unless you let us know, and so we can share across the country. Next slide. I think we are, unless that is the last slide, I think that's the last slide. So why don't I hand it over to Liz Reichart to take the reins of this and move on. Thank you. Liz?
Great. Thanks, Rodney. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Reichart. I'm the Deputy Director of Building Decarbonization and Policy at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. Welcome to this webinar on using grid edge resources to provide distribution level services. And while the phrase grid edge might give the impression of something minor or far-flung, we in the working group know better than to be fooled by this term. The range of distributed technologies and innovations known as the grid edge will be vital to ensuring that enough electricity is available as and when required in a more fully electrified world. Shifting from traditional bulk power focused grid edge resource use to targeting local distribution level needs is essential for ensuring grid reliability while also deferring costly distribution infrastructure upgrades. And I'm so excited to hear what states are doing in this space. And to that end, we're going to have 2 presentations followed by a robust audience Q&A. So with that, I would love to welcome our first presentation from Paul Martini of Newport Consulting Group, who will discuss the evolving role of grid edge resources to provide grid services for managing local distribution needs affordably. And Paul, I'll let you introduce yourself at the top of your presentation. So over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts on what's developing both in the U.S. and internationally with respect to the utilization of grid edge resources for distribution. My background, I have been doing a fair amount of commercial work with utilities, but also in terms of technical assistance to over 25 states on integrated distribution planning, looking at how grid modernization and the utilization of distributed resources for distribution in particular, but also how we take advantage of that as well in the bulk power system. And then a fair amount of work looking at how we coordinate between transmission operations and distribution operations, for example, for 2022 issues. I've been in the industry for over 40 years and have a solid background in power systems and the like. Next slide, please. I will note that while I will be touching on some work products that were developed under the DOE Office of Electricity's efforts, my presentation is not it's mine independently and does not represent the federal government or any other entity that I do work with. Next slide, please. So I think, as was said at the top of the webinar, clearly distribution expenditures are a big factor to focus on as we think about how to leverage distributed or grid edge resources. You're probably familiar with the recent paper that came from Berkeley Lab that identified where the trends have been in terms of the growth and expenditures, but also the impact on rates. As you can see in the bar chart there, distribution now is clearly the dominant driver in terms of revenue requirements and rate increases at 44%. Just to give you a sense of it, EEI's projections in terms of where capital expenditures on distribution, aging infrastructure is 28%, reliability and resilience is approximately 37%, and capacity expansion is 28%. So when we think about the impact that we can make on leveraging distributed and grid edge resources to be able to address some of these potential cost impacts, clearly there's an opportunity with capacity expansion and reliability and and the like. So there's a meaningful contribution that can be made if we approach this in a way that works from an operational standpoint, which is going to be a focus of my presentation. Next slide, please. So one of the things, as we know, as we've been thinking about and looking at hosting capacity analyses over the last 6, 7, 10 years as it's developed across the U.S. and the analysis have been expanded and refined, we understand that as DER adoption, but also load growth in various areas, we've started to see constraints emerge and become more persistent in some areas where there's been load and DER adoption. One of the things to keep in mind that tends to get overlooked sometimes is that the United States still has most of the distribution systems have still a fairly significant amount of distribution that is at a voltage levels, primary voltage levels that are below 12 kV, 12,000 volts. A lot of 4,000 volt based systems, which do not have much capacity to start with. These designs were originated 100 years ago in the 1920s. And they weren't really designed for the kind of load and the uses that we're thinking about today. So this is one of the challenges as we look at modernizing our distribution, how we can take advantage of distributed resources as part of the mix. Next slide, please. So one of the other things is we have been using more distributed resources as we see electric vehicle adoption, EV charging, home rooftop solar batteries and the like. We start to see a dynamic on a distribution feeder where we have a main line, and within that we have laterals that come off of that and a radial distribution system. And what happens is the power flows as a result of having distributed resources that are producing power or exporting, and some that are consuming or importing power, is we get an interesting mix of power flows within a distribution feeder itself. So that's what's represented here in terms of the arrows, in terms of the directional flow, and then where the constraints might be, where we see red or potentially increasing in yellow or green, which correlates to what we typically use as colors on a hosted capacity map. So what we start to see is that we can start to see constraints within the distribution feeder in what we call protection zones, that is between the reclosers in a distribution feeder, as well as on the lateral. So this starts to get fairly complicated as we start to look at the kind of analysis that's necessary to really understand how do we mitigate the constraints that might otherwise emerge, either for new loads that come on or in terms of the power flows from export from distributed generation and batteries that are exporting. Next slide, please. Next slide. So there's really two approaches we're going to talk about today. One is how do we think about integrating new loads and resources, recognize that we may have these constraints in terms of hosting capacity, capability, or in a projected case where there's not enough capacity to be able to integrate using sort of the traditional way that we've done interconnection studies. So this has emerged in terms of a technique to start to look at, which is flexible distribution connections. The original idea, well, the idea is that we manage these connections not based on the worst case, but rather we look at how we can adjust the export or the demand such that it doesn't exceed the capacity of that feeder. So that's the basic concept, but it's applied both with generating resources, which has kind of been the predominant focus to date. I'll get into this a little bit more in terms of export, but it's also being applied on the load side with EV charging and some other large loads that are coming into the system to be able to also mitigate the demand on the system. So kind of a demand limiting basis to stay within the capacity limits of the distribution feeder. Next slide, please. So there are really two approaches. The traditional, when we've done interconnection studies, or we look at studies to look at integrating larger loads into distribution. And there's in simple terms, those studies have been relatively static, and they tend to take the worst case operating condition as the basis for how they would determine whether or not there's going to be an overload or a voltage violation or the like. Conversely, when we start to think about flexible connections and a concept called dynamic operating envelope, which originated in Australia, we start to look at, in a more granular basis, the 8760, so that is all the hours in a typical year, and we look at where those constraints might be exceeded on an hourly basis over that year. And as a result, we can start to think about where in that, going back to that other diagram, where in that, over that 8760, can we start to mitigate some of that overload or voltage violation by reducing either export or the demand of that load. And so, and then the idea is that you have set up a mechanism by which you have this, the load or the generation to automatically or through a control scheme to basically stay within the limit. So this dynamic operating envelope allows resources to connect or loads to be connected in a way that is much more representative of the shape that they're either consuming or exporting into the system to stay within the constraint. Dynamic operating envelope, as I said, started in Australia. It was a way for the bulk system operator to maintain system stability because they had so much rooftop solar that it was impacting net load, similar to the duck curve concept that we've had or results that we've seen in the US. And it was a way for them to manage this from the bulk power system. More recently, over the last 5 years, this is now being applied at the distribution level for managing distribution constraints as well. In the US, we're starting to see this over the last year or two in terms of a concept that's being applied. And I'll show you a couple examples of how this is being done in the US. Next slide. So there's really two approaches that people are looking at with respect to flexible interconnections or service connections. The first is customer controlled solutions. So this has to do with how do you keep those either exports or load consumption or demand within the limits, the operating limits, that 8760 set of limits that are provided through the planning process to the customer. So one is customer controlled and the other is where the utility controls the resource or the load interface. In terms of the customer controlled solutions, one of the approaches is looking at advanced inverter settings and being able to manage that a little bit more dynamically, or having, in some cases, where the customer uses a controller on their side to manage it independent of the inverter. So there's two ways to do that, but there are technologies to basically allow the customer to manage that mitigating load or export energy into the system. The most recent CPUC, the California PUC, issued an order around limited generation profiles. And this is an example of where a customer controlled solution is used for interconnecting generation that might otherwise be seen as potentially overloading the distribution in terms of export energy. And in this case, it sets up a dynamic operating envelope, and this allows the customer to basically take responsibility for managing their export within the limits that are provided by the utility. The other is this is also can be done in terms of EV fleet charging, which is a fairly large load typically coming into a utilities distribution system. And in this case, there's an example where Southern California Edison is applying the same concept as California's limited generation profile only for load, and providing information, these parameters to the customer, who then in their automated control scheme is managing the demand on their side to stay within the limits of that service connection. Of course, the benefit is that customers can more rapidly interconnect or get service connection than otherwise they might have. Next slide, please. So the other is utility direct control solutions, where the utility manages that limit either from export or from a load standpoint and interfaces with the customer's equipment and sending signals to basically do mitigation in terms of some curtailment of exports or demand. So it's the demand management scheme that's managed by the utility. So that's happening in a couple of places in the U.S., and there's more and more examples coming online. Some of this is from just 2 years ago, and we've seen already more expansive use of these techniques across the U.S. One example is Commonwealth Edison's Mendota demonstration, and the other is National Grid's EV Charge Smart plan. But again, we have two different, both on the generation side, but also on the load side in terms of how to think about using these flexible connections as a way to accelerate both interconnection and service connections. What I will call out, though, is when we start to see a utility-based scheme, there's usually a curtailment allocation methodology that needs to be considered as part of this. The two that kind of started with, and there's more variations on these that have been are being explored. But the first is a last in, first out approach, where the first GER interconnection or load service connection is curtailed last. The pro rata method is where you allocate across on a proportional basis across all the connected flexible connections that have signed up. So this is a pretty important consideration when thinking about these approaches, particularly as we start to scale up, and if there's quite a few of these connections, this starts to get fairly complicated to manage. Next slide, please. So a couple of key considerations. Obviously, establishing clear policy and guidelines for the adoption of flexible connection methods, including, whether to pursue customer-controlled or utility-controlled approaches. There's pros and cons to both, but there are clearly two different ways it can be done. The curtailment allocation methods, that really is important to understand how that would work, how those decisions about allocation would be made, what's acceptable to stakeholders and customers, obviously, that would be done. And then, of course, there's a need to make sure that the implementation is on a non-discretionary basis. It's also important to understand that flexible connections really fit within a broader flexibility services strategy for mitigating distribution capacity investments. They're kind of can be seen as a stopgap measure until you have a more complete flexibility services implementation, so that you're not having to depend on mitigating or reducing the export or import. In fact, you could take advantage of those as part of an overall flexibility strategy. So that needs to get worked out, and that hasn't really happened yet. Customer engagement obviously is important. Data and forecasting is important, and of course, technology integration, which I'll touch on more going forward. Next slide, please. So I'll touch on distribution flexibility services next. Thanks. Next slide. Thank you. So one of the things that may not be apparent is that we see, when we really dig into it, that the use by utilities of various types of grid edge resources for mitigating distribution constraints is growing. Now, when we say that, it isn't just third-party aggregator services for distribution, such as non-wires alternative, but this also includes utility pursuit of front-of-the-meter batteries. So this is both front of the meter, behind the meter, and the other is geo-targeted demand-side management programs that are looking at distribution, mitigating distribution expenditures. So this is starting to get fairly broad. Now, we're still at a very early stage, so it's important to note that while these states are highlighted, we're still very early days in terms of how this is developing. Next slide, please. What Samir Sukkar and I put together was a framework as we've been trying to think about how we scale up the use of flexible resources, was trying to understand the pain points that we've seen and some of the barriers and challenges in terms of scaling up. And this is a bit complicated, but basically there were two dimensions here that we've thought about that had to do with, on one axis, on the vertical axis, looking at ratepayer value and also the utility operational risk management in terms of, are we achieving the operational outcomes and at a price or cost that makes sense from a ratepayer standpoint. And on the horizontal axis is the consumer that's actually providing the service, as well as the aggregator. What value and the value certainty are they getting that makes good sense, financial sense, or business sense for them in terms of participating or providing the service? So we need to be able to satisfy both of these dimensions as we look at scaling up the resource. If we have too much customer and service provider value, but don't have the performance that at a cost that makes sense, then we won't really scale. And if we have too much, the compensation and the performance requirements are too onerous, then you won't have participation. You won't have participation by the service providers in terms of providing the services. And we've seen that dynamic play out over the last 5-6 years as non-wires alternatives in the US, but also we've seen this in the UK, in Europe, and starting to happen a bit in Australia. So it's important to think about how we look at those two dimensions. And so that's how we came up with this 2x2. The other is we started to look at where are current tools for sourcing services, whether it's traditional procurement like a non-wires alternative, whether it's a retail time of use tariff, traditional DSM program, or a NEM tariff, and the emergence of local flexibility markets, which are starting to happen. So how do we think about where these kind of fit in the current, what we're currently doing within this 2x2, and how do we think about evolving this into a more effective set of solutions? Next slide, please. So one of the other things we wanted to give some thought to is that not all of these have the same ratepayer cost impact. So for example, tariffs and other price signals really aren't, from an incremental standpoint, they're relatively low cost or essentially no incremental cost to consumers in the sense, or ratepayers, I should say, in terms of revenue requirement, and then rate impacts in terms of increasing rates. Demand side management and demand flexibility programs that are geo-targeted and temporal, that may also not be incrementally an impact for ratepayers if existing programs are redirected to more geo-targeted temporal needs in addition to what they've traditionally focused on, which is bulk power system needs. So again, there could be relatively low cost to ratepayers, but increasing benefits as well. Obviously, we've got procurements and bilateral contracts, which have been part of non-wires alternatives. And of course, the cost is based on competitive proposals, but typically capped somewhere around the deferred value or avoided distribution capacity avoidance value. The local flexibility markets, these are similar to the NWA in terms of bilateral contracts. So you have that cost, plus in some of the flexibility market models, there's a transaction fee that comes, plus setting up the market itself might have a cost. Next slide, please. One of the things is that, as we think about this, our point of view is that you really need a portfolio approach to address what we need at distribution to be cost effective for ratepayers, and also to provide the certainty in terms of the reliability we need to basically defer or avoid distribution expenditures. This also has the benefit of potentially increasing the value for the customers and service providers that are actually providing the services as well. So as we looked at it, our thought was there are things that we can propose or consider to start to enhance existing techniques that we use, and then also think about how we create a portfolio to achieve this better outcome for all concerned. But it's important to recognize that no one sourcing method that is pricing, programs, procurements, flexibility markets, can address all of what we need at distribution from a cost-effective standpoint. We really need to think about how we leverage each of those elements that might come together. Next slide, please. One of the things, this is a bit busy, but what we looked at was we need to start thinking about, from a planning standpoint, how to be a little more specific about how we address the needs at the distribution level from an operational standpoint. The blue box and the green box here kind of represent two aspects of kind of what we're dealing with, in terms of the blue being more traditional analysis around technical potential or available potential or addressable potential for distributed resources, the kind of studies that Brattle and E3 and others have done. But when we get into the green side, this is where which we now get into the grid operations side and the engineering, where they're looking at it from a different kind of lens. That is a risk management lens related to operational performance. And so we need to think about how we bridge those two worlds, because otherwise we've got a bit of a chasm here that we're trying to deal with, and transitioning from kind of a planning approach, which looks at some potential, but we need to translate that into operational practice. And so one of the things we've been examining is, how do we start to think about applying in this model some risk-based, some risk management type techniques, not unlike that we do at the bulk system, but apply it at distribution, such that we can start to get to a more robust assessment of what really is possible, and how do we then come up with mitigation approaches to be able to get to the level of performance that we need to achieve, to really defer significant amounts of capital investment in the distribution system. Next slide, please. One of the other things that we need to look at too, as we do these analyses, is recognizing that not always our bulk system peak needs occur at the same time as a distribution feeder is also peaking. So we have this convergence and divergence issue on distribution and bulk system, depending on location, depending on where in the distribution are we seeing the constraint that we're trying to mitigate relative to the bulk system. So there's a number of issues here that need to be examined in greater detail as we start to look at how do we maximize the value for both distribution and potentially bulk system, but also recognizing that, for example, existing programs that we may have may not actually be benefiting distribution because they're oriented to bulk system that has a different load shape than what we're trying to deal with at distribution for a particular feeder. So one of the things is doing a little more detailed analysis to look at these two dynamics that are going on with respect to convergence and divergence on particular feeders. Next slide, please. So in sum, there's a number of considerations related to flexibility services. How do we integrate these various sourcing approaches to holistically consider the use of flexible connections, but also the pricing and programs and procurement and flexibility markets? How do they come together so we come up with an overall strategy? I think this is an area that for development, we haven't really done this yet in the US. It hasn't been done in the UK or in the EU. They've kind of approached it from a different direction. They're largely using, by the way, front of the meter resources like batteries, and as well as distributed generation, fossil-based generation, cogen, and the like. In the UK, there's some residential, but not much. There's some commercial building, but not much. And the same in several of the European countries that are kind of at the forefront. There's a lot more battery and generation based on distribution being used. Australia really hasn't gotten here yet with respect to flexible distributed resources other than the flexible connections. It's important, I think, for us to, as several states are revisiting the non-wires alternative procurement approaches, because they haven't really been working that well, and I think for any of the parties that are involved. And so there's an opportunity, I think, to consider some enhancements that could address some of the cost and risk factors to improve participation and viability, as well as the overall performance for ratepayers and utilities. We also need to think about a more of a bottom-up approach to assess GER optimization, perhaps first at the distribution level before thinking about the bulk system, so that we can understand the convergent divergent issues as part of looking at that overall value in the planning process. Also looking at a version of this techno-econometric planning and portfolio development to really understand what's needed from a reliability standpoint to address the operational and engineering concerns at the distribution level, so that we can start to think about how we can scale this up more effectively. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul, for that presentation. That was a lot of food for thought. I see the chat is active, and Paul, I'm wondering if we could pause for a moment and address a couple of the questions in the chat before we move on to Robert. So the first one that I'm seeing is from Heather over at the Washington UTC. What is meant by non-discretionary implementation? I think this was in the first half of your presentation.
Non-discretionary. I'm sorry, not sure which reference that is. I'd have to look at my slide here. I'm not sure.
No worries. We can give you a minute while Robert presents to look up that one. But I'm wondering in the meantime if you have a response to Aaron, who's asking, has Newport compiled a list of the jurisdictions specifically valuing geo-targeted DSM?
We do have some information on that. So when we did the state analysis, we did look at the states and the utilities within the states to look at whether they were doing, in some cases, utility-owned batteries, for example, like the Texas utilities have been pursuing, or they were looking to do geo-targeted DSM, or if they were doing NWA or the like. So I think we do, and I can check and see what the analyst has broken down, and we could share that if we have, assuming we have it.
Excellent, thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Oh, non-discretionary implementation has to do with basically this making sure that the utility isn't biasing any curtailment for one entity or another, so that you're getting a fair, the allocation method is being done in a fair should have been non-discriminatory, not non-discretionary.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Appreciate you pausing to take a couple of those questions, Paul. Folks continue to think of questions and put those in the chat. Without further ado, Robert Cully is joining us from the New York Department of Public Service, who will speak on New York State's efforts to advance grid edge resources, including demand flexibility. So over to you, Robert.
Thanks, Liz. Next slide, please. So today we'll talk through some of New York's flexibility programs. I'll give a quick snapshot of our flexibility programs on the wholesale and retail level. And then we'll walk through in a little more detail some of the distribution level demand response programs that we have here in New York. We'll walk through some non-wire alternatives, our process and regulatory framework for developing those projects. I'll give you some examples of the successful non-wire alternatives that we have in New York State, and also some lessons learned. And then we'll walk through the value stack, which is a relatively recent development in New York State for how to move beyond net energy metering for compensating generation resources on the distribution system. Next slide, please. So flexibility programs. Next slide, please. quick snapshot. We've got a bevy of demand response programs, both at the wholesale level, operated by our New York Independent System Operator, or New York ISO, or NISO. The key one there is what we call the Special Case Resources Program, which is a day ahead, 21-hour advance notice transmission reliability program. And we have a number of distribution level demand response programs operated by each distribution utility. These include a number of commercial programs. You'll note the the brackets there that are really based on meter data against baseline loads on event days, and also mass market programs for residential and small commercial customers that are technology specific. Now, why did I include parentheses or quotation marks around commercial? The commercial programs are traditionally based on advanced metering, which now with advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI, residential and small commercial program customers are now have the metering needed to participate in these programs. So while we still call them commercial programs because that's the market segment they're originally designed for, the mass market segment is able to participate in those programs as AMI rolls out. One of the things that we try to be careful about is we make careful consideration as we're looking at simultaneous participation in the programs to make sure that we can maximize the amount of simultaneous participation in wholesale and distribution level programs. New York State operates also a number of electric vehicle managed charging programs operated by each distribution utility. We have a slew of residential programs and commercial programs. However, I'm not going to spend much time on those today because those programs are in development for new program options, and also existing programs, especially on the residential side, are currently under a review process. So anything I say about those today might change in the relatively near future. Next slide, please. So let's talk through our peak shaving commercial demand response programs. We basically have two main options here. One is, I'll call it an at-large program, the Commercial System Relief Program, or CSRP, and the other is a contracted program, the Term Dynamic Load Management, or DLM program. I'll call that one the Term DLM program. Both of these programs are day-ahead 21-hour advance notice and have specified 4-hour call windows that for some utilities like Con Edison are location specific, while all of the other utilities have a single call window for their entire service territories. But those call windows are based on identified system needs. For both of these programs, all enrolled resources are required to respond when an event is called, and that event is typically called when the utility is expecting to see peak conditions on a day-ahead basis. The programs are available May through September, and both programs use a two-payment system, although the two programs differ in specifically how those payment levels are set. For the CSRP, the reservation payment is established before the beginning of the program year. Typically, the payment rates are set often a couple of years in advance because we haven't really changed the payment rates in a couple of years. It's all based on the marginal cost of service studies. And the utility pays this reservation payment to all of its participants based on their demonstrated performance in the program on a monthly basis, whether events are called or not. You can think of this almost as like an insurance premium that the utility is paying to its demand response program participants. When an event is called, during that event, the utility makes a second type of payment called a performance payment, and that's based on the participants' measured energy provided during that event. You can think of this essentially as the deductible that the utility pays, continuing on with the insurance allegory there. So that's for CSRP. For the term DLM, the payment levels are established in the contracting process, particularly the reservation payment. And each of the term DLM participants basically have the option during contracting to set their own reservation payments, subject to bilateral agreement with the utility. The CSRP does not have any penalties for non-performance. However, the term DLM program does have penalties for non-performance that coincide with the potentially higher level of performance payment, and also the term DLM program offers multi-year contracted payment levels that can be a little more reliable for customers. Both programs allow simultaneous participation in wholesale level programs and the distribution reliability programs that I'm going to talk about in just a second. Both require advanced metering, such as AMI. Both require any customer can participate through an aggregator, although particularly large customers for the CSRP can enroll directly through the utility, provided they can provide 50 kilowatts or more of load relief on their own. Whereas for term DLM, you have to participate through an aggregator that is contracted. And the CSRP does allow for net energy metering, or NEM, customers to participate with given caveats to avoid double payments for the same service. Term DLM program is that NEM customer participation is not allowed. Now, I spent a lot of time going through these two programs in particular because we're going to see parallels on the distribution reliability side in a lot of these rules. Next slide, please. So moving on to our distribution reliability programs, we have the Distribution Load Relief Program, or DLRP, and our Auto DLM program. These programs are somewhat similar in idea and somewhat similar in payment structure to the CSRP and term DLM program, with some of the major differences being DLRP requires customers to be ready within 2 hours to respond to a reliability event. And those reliability events can last up to 6 hours. And the resources, only certain resources must respond to a DLRP event. For example, if a substation is experiencing potential overload conditions, only customers that are attached to that substation would be called to perform. Similarly, Auto DLM, this is really our demand response program that is crafted with batteries in mind, and it requires as quick as 5-minute response time to either peak shaving or reliability events. It requires a 4-hour event duration and is only available in certain specified high-value areas of each utility service territory. When a reliability event is called, only the affected participants need respond to that. However, peak shaving events get called for all participants. Both of these programs similarly are made through September, have a reservation and performance payment. DLRP has no penalties for non-performance, whereas Auto DLM does have a penalty for non-performance. And we try to allow for wholesale demand response program participation in both of these options. However, since the Auto DLM program allows for both peak shaving and reliability events. You can only participate in the auto DLM program. You can't also participate in, say, the CSRP at the same time. Again, both of these require advanced metering and have some caveats or no participation at all for net energy metering customers. Next slide, please. Moving on to our mass market programs, both of these programs here, the through line is that the programs really look at have a similar idea of utility control of customer behind the meter equipment. For the Bring Your Own Thermostat program, it allows utilities to modify smart thermostat temperature set points for central air conditioners. Those events under the BYOT program can be called for peak shaving reliability or even wholesale capacity peaks, with the caveat that generally speaking, customers participating in the BYOT program cannot also participate in the wholesale programs. The BYOT program has a one-time enrollment incentive, basically welcome into the program, as well as a modest annual participation incentive that needs to be earned by allowing the utility to control your air conditioner set point some percentage of the time of the events called. One of the key differences between our residential programs and the commercial programs is that we have no limitation on net energy metering customer participation in the residential programs, and that's very much by design. Our other new technology-based program for residential customers is a Bring Your Own Battery option. It's a new program that is currently being rolled out and will likely be live in most areas of New York State for next summer season, and it will allow a utility to control residential scale battery export. That participation is going to be measured by using the internal battery metering, and similar to the BYOT, it'll be called for any number of reasons and require that the customer also not participate in the wholesale programs. The incentives that we've got set up so far, although not entirely formalized, it's going to be a pay-for-performance model. And we're going to be looking at the average amount of load relief provided by customers during a season in terms of kilowatts, multiplied by a flat incentive rate. And again, no limitation on NEM customer participation. Next slide, please. So our general philosophy and lessons learned on demand response programs so far is we want to have a good balance of programs and participation options that can provide a good amount of meaningfully different options for customers to participate in without overwhelming them with too many different programs. You move from really highly white glove, almost curated and easy to participate options that cost more and therefore are less lucrative to maintain cost effectiveness, to much more advanced and lucrative options, but are more complex and may carry an element of non-performance risk. Some customers prefer to move from the more curated programs to the more lucrative options. For example, in the Con Edison service territory in New York City, we've seen customers move from the Bring Your Own Thermostat program into our particularly CSRP program, but others don't. So it makes sense to provide a good menu of options for customers to participate in. For the really highly curated programs, the utility is the sole point of contact, essentially, whereas the more advanced programs have a good population of aggregators that do most of the marketing and customer outreach. We want to really make sure that we maximize opportunities for simultaneous enrollment in different programs. And that means making sure that customers can participate in all of the different levels of pancakes of distribution level services as well as wholesale level services. And especially when considering the residential market, the programs really need to play nice with net energy metering because that's most of the population of net energy metering customers are residential in New York State. Next slide. Moving on to non-wire alternatives. Next slide. So what makes non-wire alternatives projects successful in New York State? First, we have a standard process for identifying non-wire alternative opportunities and requirements that the utilities have to attempt to develop those opportunities when they're identified. We have a predefined mechanism for approval and cost recovery of cost-effective non-wire alternative projects that provides regulatory certainty to utilities that engage in them. And we try to make our cost recovery mechanisms a level playing field so that utilities don't have a outsized incentive to invest in only their own traditional CapEx spending. We also allow the utilities to earn their return on non-wire alternative project spending, so they have at least a dollar for dollar same incentive to invest in utility level traditional T&D infrastructure as well as non-wire alternative projects. Finally, we put some icing on the cake here with a shareholder incentive for successfully implementing non-wire alternatives and enhance those incentives to encourage the utility to achieve its non-wire alternative projects under budget. Next slide, please. So this is a basic process flow sheet of the non-wire alternative process. It starts off with identified capital projects, goes through a screening criteria to identify the projects that are most likely to be successful, requires the utility to develop market solutions for those identified projects, checks to see that the responses to those solicitations are sufficient to avoid the need for infrastructure. And after that, if all of those things are favorable, then the utility moves forward with implementing the non-wire alternative and can then, from there, potentially earn a shareholder incentive. Other than that, there's many different outs to get to right back to the status quo of utility moving forward with the capital project if the project isn't right. Next slide, please. So let's walk through this NWA screening criteria. Oh, sorry, the screening process. This is a list of questions that's asked about each CapEx project identified by the utility, particularly in a rate proceeding. And some of the questions are differentiated based on whether the project is considered large or small. We'll talk through that in the next slide. The thing I want to hammer home here is that if the utility answers yes to all of the NWA screening criteria questions, they have to attempt to develop an NWA project to seek to defer or eliminate that capital project. If at any point along the line they answer no to one of the screening criteria questions, they can still attempt to develop an NWA project from that capital project if they so choose, but they're not specifically required to do so. Following the NWA screening, the identified NWA opportunities are brought to the market for solutions, typically through an RFP, request for proposals. And the utilities can also use existing energy efficiency, demand response, other load management, or electrification programs as part of the portfolio of solutions to that issue using location-specific kickers from the more generalized incentives offered under those programs. Next slide, please. So the NWA screening criteria look at the project need type, particularly load relief and reliability projects. Some projects just don't make sense for non-wire alternatives like necessary asset condition replacements or infrastructure upgrades needed to interconnect new businesses. We look at the timeline that's available for the traditional project to move forward. We want to make sure that the utility has enough time to actually go through the solicitation process, contracting, and all of that to actually implement successful non-wire alternatives that can meet the system needs. And that means for most large projects, at least a 3-year runway, and maybe a little shorter for smaller projects. We also look at minimum cost thresholds, roughly about $1 million minimum for large projects. And that's to make sure that we're focusing on non-wire alternatives with enough avoidable transmission and distribution infrastructure benefits to power a cost-effective portfolio solution. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk through, maybe highlight a few of these successful non-wire alternative programs. The kind of Cadillac program, our flagship one is Con Edison's Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program, which sought 60 megawatts of load relief in the Brooklyn and Queens area, starting back in 2013. And we have very successfully deferred the need for $1 billion+ substation for about 10 years now. The company in that case is just now beginning to work through its substation construction plans, whereas it would have previously had to have had that program or that substation in place beginning construction in late 2013. So big success there. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. Paul mentioned a little earlier, despite sending the right price signals, non-wire alternative projects are very difficult to implement. We have a significant log of non-wire alternative opportunities that we couldn't make go despite best efforts, and the number of successful projects is a relative handful compared to the projects that we couldn't get to go. Some small projects are notoriously difficult to implement, particularly in Con Edison's networked grids as opposed to more of a radial grid. One particular example of this was an opportunity in Columbus Circle in Midtown New York City, where the networked secondary system that has multiple pathways for electricity to get to customers, we found that that also means that targeted load relief is diluted and goes to different places instead of just where it's specifically needed. We've had a number of different NWA projects fail after contracting due to losing site control from the developer, particularly energy storage-based projects that had a willing site host back out due to siting and other concerns. Finally, you got to make sure that your NWA project participants are willing to take responsibility for reliability issues for reliability projects. We've had projects where, again, we've gotten through most of the contracting provisions where the developer backed out of some provisions of what the NWA was intended to achieve when they decided they were not satisfied with taking on liquidated damages provisions if they were unable to respond to a reliability call. Next slide, please. We'll move on to the value stack. Next slide. So the value stack grew out of net energy metering. And we'll just walk through a little bit net energy metering before talking through the value stack itself. So if you're not familiar, net energy metering is a volumetric compensation mechanism with a compelling message, right? Spin the meter backwards. What we've found over a number of years of working predominantly under the net energy metering regime is that there is a significant potential for unreasonable cost shifts from NEM participants to non-participants, particularly under volumetric rates like most residential customers are under here in New York State. To the extent that your fixed monthly customer charges don't recover the full fixed costs of the grid, some of those fixed costs then get included in volumetric charges, and those are then avoided by NEM customers. Also, many of our energy efficiency and other policy program costs are recovered through volumetric surcharges from residential customers, which NEM customers similarly avoid. We've tried to get around some of this issue by a new charge called the Customer Benefit Contribution Charge, which has a modest fee for monthly fee based on the size of a installation in kilowatts as of January 1st of 2022. We've moved beyond statutory net energy metering required by our legislature to now what we call NEM Phase 1, which continues the net energy metering construct for new mass market customers, but essentially puts a 20-year time limit on that, where at the end of that 20-year period, those customers will be converted into whatever the dominant compensation mechanism is at that time. So for the time being, our mass market customers continue to be eligible for NEM Phase 1, as well as customers that were already NEM customers prior to the value stack being developed in mid-2017. The value stack, on the other hand, is a financial compensation mechanism that takes the values of net exports and converts them into a dollar credit. There are 5 main components of the value stack, which I'm going to go through in the next slide. Some of which are only for clean technologies, some of which have a locational eligibility requirements, and there's also some additional components for market transition away from NEM and other policy goals that, for the most part, have now been phased out or are in the process of being phased out. The value stack includes some values that float on a hour-to-hour basis with market prices, while others are locked in at the time of interconnection for a period of at least 10 years. Who's eligible for the value stack? Any customer that's eligible for NEM can opt into the value stack, although it's a one-time irrevocable choice, so it's a big decision for any customer. Large commercial solar farms and community distributed generation projects are required to take the value stack now, as well as a relatively new program called Statewide Solar for All, which essentially is a market backstop that helps fund our low-income bill assistance programs with the financial value made from solar and other centralized large facility resources operating under the value stack. Next slide, please. So the core value stack components. Number 1 is our wholesale energy value. This is the actual hourly New York ISO market prices at the time that the generation is occurring, grossed up for losses. We have wholesale capacity value, or ICAP as we call it, installed capacity. There's three alternatives that customers can choose from here. Alternative one is a flat monthly dollar per kilowatt hour value. That's based on the monthly ICAP cost during any given month, flattened out for turning that dollar per kilowatt value into a dollar per kilowatt hour value. And this is very popular with solar customers. Alternative two is just a seasonal shaped alternative one. Not particularly popular with anybody at the moment. And alternative three is for dispatchable resources, but any resource can opt in from alternatives one or two into three. That really matches the methodology for paying out avoided installed capacity costs with the way that large customer installed capacity tags are set, typically on a number of peak hours during July or August non-weekend afternoons. The environmental value, which is based on the value of avoided carbon emissions, generally the societal cost of carbon, for clean technologies only. We have the demand reduction value, which is based on avoided marginal cost of utility transmission and distribution plant, which can vary pretty significantly from utility to utility based on the costs of their systems, and is only applicable during certain specified hours during summer, weekday, 4 or 5 hour periods, depending upon the utility. Generally speaking, between 1 to 6 p.m. or 2 to 6 p.m. Finally, we have what's called the locational system relief value, or LSRV, and it's only available in certain designated high-value areas and only available for a specified amount of capacity within those areas. This compensation mechanism is based on customer performance during events, and the utility has to call at least 10 events per year. Participants are provided with a set dollar per kilowatt payment during the event based on the minimum kilowatts of capacity delivered during that event. Next slide, please. So we developed the value stack in New York State back in March 2017. How's it going? Well, it's going pretty well, all things considered. So this slide here just shows that we've got a nice continuing growth up through the early part of this year, and we'll see where that goes from here. And that is the end of my slides. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Robert, for that presentation. Excited to dig into those lessons learned. We've got a question in the chat I'm wondering if you could address before we jump into the Q&A. I see Stephanie writing, is NYSERDA's Integrated Energy Data Resource Program a part of these efforts? The IEDR, of course, being that statewide centralized energy use data platform.
So the IEDR exists separately from these programs, but it's something that can be utilized and leveraged to help explain the impacts of the programs and also help aggregators and other developers and things figure out how best to market and explain to customers what types of bill savings they might see by investing in whichever technology product or participating in the demand response program. So I would say that the IEDR is more of a tool for the market to use that relies on utility data, whereas the programs that I just talked through are more programs and tariffs that are available for customers to use.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give folks a couple of more minutes to add their questions into the chat for our two presenters, Paul and Robert. But before we take your questions, and while we have the GEB working group here, Rodney suggested I give a plug for the work that Massachusetts is advancing in this space. So currently underway in Massachusetts, we are engaging in a grid services study that is being led by our partners at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center and informed by the state's 3 investor-owned utilities, us at the Department of Energy Resources, and our own Attorney's General Office. The goal of which is to create a compensation framework for DERs, providing location-specific grid services to the distribution grid. So hopefully this final report is going to include exploring the value that using DERs flexibly can provide, particularly in environmental justice communities, which is an exciting and underexplored aspect. An additional piece of this work is going to include an implementation roadmap that will hopefully guide long-term offerings for using DER flexibly to support the distribution system. So many interesting things to come. This report is going to be released at the end of the summer. It's currently being supported by our partners at E3 and RMI. When it is released, we will ensure that the report is distributed to the working group. But it's really been a great effort of all the partners, a lot of diverse engagement, great participation by our 3 IOUs. And I'll drop a link in the chat to the webpage if you're interested in learning more about the process or the product that's arriving at the end of the summer. Seeing no questions in the chat, I'm wondering if I can seed our last 6 minutes of Q&A with a broader level question while the audience is still ruminating. Paul, Robert, you both talked about tapping flexibly in a geo-targeted manner. Curious to know what you see as the main impediments to unlocking DERs and demand flexibility at the distribution level and in a local specific way, right? Is it a financial motivation? Paul, you touched on policy. Are there technical barriers? What are you seeing in this work?
It's a combination of things. I think first is I think we need to address from a planning standpoint how we more effectively consider energy efficiency, demand response in the existing programs to the extent that there's flexibility in changing how we focus those. We haven't really always used those as part of the planning process, really kind of doing a resource plan at distribution in that context and developing a resource stack, if you will, as part of the distribution planning process for looking at how we can leverage the various types of resources that are available. We don't do resource kind of planning at distribution like that we do at the bulk system. And so kind of taking a version of that, if you will, adapting some of those concepts. This also means that we, from a performance standpoint, we need to look at energy efficiency more for pay-per-performance type approach because, Robert touched on this and I did as well. I mean, non-performance at distribution is not a good thing because there aren't alternatives at the time typically to be able to backfill if it doesn't perform. So that's where some of this operational risk has been an impediment. So I think there's an opportunity to look at those and say, how can we firm these up in terms of resources? But it also means that we need to change how we think about the planning side of it as well.
I'm not sure I have much more to add. A lot of times when we put out prices or higher values for certain areas, you can put the prices out, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So we have seen that some technologies, for example, have an easier time siting in our defined LSRV areas. And sometimes we've seen sometimes that just having the enhanced incentives for already popular programs just kind of supercharges the participation in those certain high value areas. We've also seen a really significant impact of both good and bad performance with non-wire and I'm thinking specifically of non-pipe alternatives, the gas NWA equivalent, where some of those programs you really require, because you're so hyper specific with targeting literally individual customers on a line of leak prone pipe that you're looking to you need all of the customers on that line to be able to avoid to get off of gas, to be able to not invest in a replacement for that pipe segment. You literally need to have kitchen table conversations with customers, and there's a balancing act between your implementation costs to be able to actually have the manpower to do that, and the benefits of the project or program itself.
Did we lose Liz? Perhaps. Let me continue with another question in the chat that I saw from Jessica Harrison. How do you see the interplay between grid investment and DR playing out as new capital investments are made? E.g., how manage potentially dropping or variable DR values?
This may be, if I understand the question, related to, if we think about where our focus has been for a lot of the non-wires alternatives in terms of deferral value, and then at some point there's a step up in load and such that you need to be able to actually do the capacity expansion. I think as we better understand what the potential is, and refine our approach with respect to just leveraging distributed resources and flexible load, I think we'll have a better understanding of whether there's the potential to actually avoid distribution investment. And we're not there yet, but I think that's where, as I've said before, better understanding from a planning and operational standpoint, what's possible and what's going to be required. I think there is a potential to do more avoidance than just deferral, but it's going to take some work and some changes in the way that we approach this. Particularly, I think with some of the earlier questions about energy efficiency and existing demand and response. I think we need to better understand what that possibility is, and then of course we've got technology innovation around battery technology that's just, when we think about where we were 10 or 15 years ago, we're significantly further ahead in terms of cost effectiveness and performance. And we're clearly still on a curve where we're going to have increasing performance on that over time. So it's quite possible that we may actually have more options to basically manage this than we do today. So I'm optimistic that I think we can take a bigger part of that capital avoidance over time.
Great. I see we're at the end of this time, not the end of time in the universe or anything like that. Liz is back, but I would like to take a moment to invite Robin Maslowski, who works with PLMA, and she will say what PLMA stands for, and invite her to make her remarks here.
Thanks, Rod, and very much appreciate the invitation to join here. And I know we're over, so I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible. PLMA used to stand for Peak Load Management Alliance, and we've rebranded it to a flexible load management community, acknowledging that the world of DR has evolved quite a bit as we're now in the GER world, or however we'll call it. So we have Olivia Patterson on and AJ Howard also, who are co-leading an initiative with myself on load flexibility valuation. And through that working group, we identified through the discussions with our members that the value of load flexibility in some of these exact topics that have been coming up through Robert and Paul and Liz's conversations of helping to either defer or avoid or bridge or geo-target distribution, investment, or use is a area that we're lacking some information and missing potentially some value streams or not fully capturing them. And so we have this working group going currently to try and bring up case studies where we're highlighting those, and really excited to see the valuation report that you all are releasing now and sort of see what you have in there. But that is something we have planned to share out some results from at the fall conference for PLMA in Las Vegas. And we welcome anyone joining those conversations. And if you have case studies to share on that topic, we're also happy to hear more. Thank you, Rod.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate this and appreciating your participation. Looking forward to some collaborative opportunities. Let me hand it back to Liz as our moderator to finish the afternoon.
Thank you all for joining this webinar, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you all. And again, August 7th is our next. Thank you to Liz. Thank you to Rob. Thank you to Paul. Thank you also to Jasmine Shia, my NASEO colleague, who's behind the curtain making this operate. Grateful for her work. And thank you all. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.